at the UCLA program. And I wanted to be here today to sort of share some of the ideas I'm hoping to explore during my dissertation, but also connect that to the legacy of Guru Gobind Singh Ji as we're discussing today. So just as sort of a broad introduction to the research I'm planning to do, something that I've started to reflect on over the last year or so is thinking about how the Sikh diaspora connects to their sense of collective identity. And to give this some sort of context, as I finished my undergrad, I was fortunate enough to receive a fellowship which allowed me to travel through 15 different countries for about a year. And as I was traveling, not sort of as an intentional type of research, but rather just to connect with my sense of community as I was on my own as a 21-year-old in places I'd never been, I seeked out my Sangit as I traveled. And something that was interesting to me was interacting with the diaspora outside of the West and seeing the ways that they conceptualize their Sikh identity much differently than I had experienced sort of growing up as a Sikh in the Midwestern US and also living on the East Coast. And so I started to think about how our culture that we're surrounded by, how government and policies that we interact with all sort of shape our sense of collective identity as a community and how we decide to situate ourselves within the society that we exist in. And as I was thinking today about how this connects to the legacy of Guru Gobind Singh Ji, I started to think about the Sikh concept of Sarbat Khalsa. And so a lot of you might be familiar with this term as sort of an event that takes place. There have been many, not many actually, quite a few Sarbat Khalsas. It's not frequent for these to happen because it requires, in essence, the entirety of the Sikh Panth, the Sikh community, to gather in order to make a collective decision. But the idea of Sarbat Khalsa that I'm interested in discussing today is rather Sarbat Khalsa as a mentality, as a concept, and how we can connect that to the way that we present ourselves as a Sikh community. So in order to break that down, again, for those of you who aren't familiar, Sarbat Khalsa is something that comes up in one of our Sikh prayers and is essentially the idea of a collective consciousness. And so the line specifically that I'm thinking of is from our ardas, from the sort of request that we make at the end of most Sikh services. And the line says, Rithme Sarbat Khalsa ji ki ardas hai ji, Sarbat Khalsa ji ko Vaheguru, Vaheguru, Vaheguru Jitala. And essentially what this line is asking or requesting is that Sarbat Khalsa, the entirety of the Khalsa, creates this sense of, is able to connect collectively with this idea of having Vaheguru in our jit, in our consciousness. And through this, we sort of start to understand the idea of Sarbat Khalsa as a mentality, as a consciousness, and how it's significant for the Sikh community globally to have this level of collective consciousness. And so, additionally, on top of that, there's also the sense of Sarbat Khalsa as a collective consciousness that exists through Guru Panth and Guru Granth. And what that means is that with the existence of Guru Panth, of the presence of the Sikh community, we are also meant to be acting on the same level of the Guru Granth Sahib, that through our actions, through our collective consciousness, we should be centering Guru Granth Sahib. And so when we think about this, when we think about Sarbat Khalsa as a mentality rather than an event, although of course we've seen the consciousness attempt to arise through these certain events, I want to start to consider how we as a collective Sikh community, so just to take a step back, as I'm just starting my PhD program, I'm definitely going to have more questions than answers today, but I sort of want to start this conversation and I'm happy to continue it with you all as well. But some of the things I'm starting to think about are how we can have this Sarbat Khalsa mentality as a larger Sikh community, because that really was the intent. And obviously, we can think of, as most of us here, part of the diaspora, part of perhaps the US diaspora, the larger Western diaspora, but also globally, how as a Sikh community can we sort of connect on this level of consciousness. And so some of the questions that I'm thinking about are, what are incentives to create a Sarbat Khalsa mentality, perhaps both individually and also communally? How are we even able to pursue that, and what would Sarbat Khalsa actually look like? And so in terms of thinking about our incentives, obviously on an individual level, when we think about Sikhi and how we practice Sikhi, there's the idea that as we are Sikhs and as we are attempting to become Sikhs and follow Gurbani, there is the need to sort of raise our own individual level of consciousness by connecting through Gurbani, by doing seva, by instilling these ideas and having Gurmat, having the Guru's wisdom rather than our own, right? And so that's, I think, a very clear way to think about it individually, but then communally, again, obviously we have these ideas of Sangat, of Sadh Sangat, how we should surround ourselves with individuals who are also inspiring us towards this consciousness. But what I'd like to question and think about is also in terms of how we behave and how we engage with the larger, perhaps nation state that we're involved in. How are we also acting with that mentality, not just as a homogenous Sikh community, but when we're also interacting with in other spaces such as this, or through Sikh community organizations, or through our Gurdwara. So how can we instill this mentality in all of our actions? And I won't take too much longer because I know I'm very literally between you and your langar. So just to kind of share a few more thoughts, I think that we're in a really interesting time right now because as recently as this last week, we're seeing larger and larger Sikh presence, particularly here in the US. We've seen the first election of a Sikh mayor. Of course, we had an Uncle G who was a mayor in Charlottesville before, but Ravi is actually the first elected Sikh mayor. So that's an interesting thought. We also have several Sikh council members who have been elected around the country in, I believe, Kent, Washington, and a few other places. So we're seeing actual political representation of Sikhs. We're also seeing more and more sort of community engagement through our Gurdwara and using Gurdwara as actual community space. Something that comes to mind right now is that the Swan Network, which is a community fundraising platform, is right now, I think, in the midst of sort of their fundraising week. And so also, how are we as a Sikh community thinking about how to utilize our resources, both financially in terms of time, and pushing those towards, again, a Sarbat Khalsa mentality of sort of raising this collective Sikh consciousness. And then finally, I think also, are we thinking about how to hold both ourselves responsible, but also our leaders and our organizations responsible as they act really on behalf of the Sikh community. I think as someone who was raised in the Midwest, in Wisconsin, as someone who is very visible compared to her peers, I have the sort of cliche story of, my brother and I were always the only Sikhs in the school and all of that, but that was very, very much focused on by my parents, the very cliche idea that, if you do something, people are always going to know that this is what Sikhs do and this is what they look like. And of course, that's something that is spoken a lot in our communities, and obviously not just the Sikh community, a lot of communities of color. But I think, how do we connect that to Sikh philosophy and Sikhi, and thinking about how to really increase that again to this level of Sarbat Khalsa, other ideas that are talked about in Sikhi, of sort of raising our consciousness to a Gurmat level rather than a Manmat level. So those are the ideas that I wanted to share with you all today. I appreciate everyone being here, and thank you to Narendran for inviting me. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.